Welcome all to our afternoon briefing, and if it's okay, we're going to start off with a presentation by Mr. Chris Boynton and on changes to the city's voting system. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. This is subject matter you've heard a lot about recently, but we are committed to having a thorough public discussion, and this is another step in that process. We've retitled this to upcoming changes to the city's election system to make clear to the public that changes are coming. They are not potential. We don't know what they look like yet, but changes are coming by virtue of both state legislation and the federal lawsuit that we've been talking about. My effort today will be to go through the history of the city's election system, speak briefly about our current election system, talk about the Holloway case and what it has accomplished at this point and where we are in that case, as well as the General Assembly action from the 2021 session in Richmond, following finally on the opinion and order that the court entered in Holloway and the next steps for this body and for the public. You'll recall that our current election system was formed in 1963 when the modern city of Virginia Beach was created, when then the smaller city of Virginia Beach merged with Princess Anne County. After the merger, there was a 7-borough system. 6 of those boroughs or districts were magisterial districts for Princess Anne County, from Princess Anne County, which elected 1 member who lived in each district and who was elected by the residents of the district. Then the political compromise at that point was that the former city of Virginia Beach had a single district but with 5 members, all of whom were elected by and from the district. That's how you originally got to a body of 11. The Dush v. Davis case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1967. That resulted in a change that became the foundational bedrock of the system until this year. It changed to a 7-residence district, 4 at-large member system. At that time, one of the 4 at-large members elected by the body, or all 4 elected at-large members were non-mayor seats. The mayor was at that time selected by the members of city council. In 1988, that changed, and the city adopted at-large election of the mayor, and one of the 4 at-large spots became the mayor's spot in 1988. In 1990, we saw a mayor's commission that was created by Mayor Obendorf recommend 7 districts of equal population with 1 council member elected by both from and by the voters of the district. So in 1990, there was a mayor's commission recommendation for what we call a ward system. It would have had still 4 at-large members, 7 ward members, and that would have still added up to 11 council members. There was a referendum that followed the mayor's commission in '94. That commission or that referendum resulted in a request to the General Assembly to both change the city charter to require equal population of districts as well as to implement a ward system. In 1995, the General Assembly considered that request that came from the first referendum, and it granted the request for equal population of districts, but it declined a ward system at that time. It directed the city to conduct a second referendum in 1996. That referendum occurred and, in fact, supported the system you have had until now, the residence district system, where members are elected by the voters of the city at large, not simply the residents of the district, but that the representative from those 7 districts does still have to reside in their district. In 1997, the district court ruled on a motion to dismiss in the city's favor in a lawsuit challenging the system that we have today under the Voting Rights Act, and particularly under Section 2, and the court denied that claim at that point in time. And then the other significant change in your election system over time was in 2008, you went from May to November elections. Your current system has existed in the exact same current form since 1996 and has been substantially the same since 1967. It is governed by your city charter, Section 3.01, which is a document governing the city's governance that is controlled by the General Assembly, not by the members of this body. And that charter says you will have an 11-member city council, 4 of whom, including the mayor, are to be elected at large and may reside anywhere in the city, and 7 of whom are also elected at large but must reside within their district. And then by virtue of a decennial or every 10-year census, the district boundaries get redrawn, and we're up for that again this year before the end of the calendar year once census data becomes available. A couple of points here are that the school board has historically been elected using the same method that is set forth in city charter, section 1604. The one material difference is the chair does not have to be an at-large member. Rather, the chair is elected by the members of the school board. The criticism of our current election system is not a new one. It has existed in various iterations over the last 20 or 30 years. The critique is that when you have the at-large election of all 11 council members, you are allowing the majority to dictate all 11 council seats. And that could have the effect of diluting votes of minority groups if there were racially polarized voting. But even if it's not racially polarized, the majority always gets their choice on all 11 seats. And so whether it's a political majority or an ethnic majority or any other type of majority, that's the criticism of your current system. This is a visual depiction of that. You have voters from all walks of life and the example on the left, but then they elect council members that reflect the majority is the argument. If you split into voting districts, or what we're calling wards today, then you have a smaller circle of individuals, a smaller group of individuals who vote for their representative and only their representative. Then if you draw those districts in such a way to concentrate minority populations within the one or more of those ward districts, it creates an opportunity for minorities to elect what we say in law are their candidates of choice, that we will use the term interchangeably, opportunity district in this instance, as well as majority minority district in our conversation today. And you see what happens when potentially you draw those districts smaller as opposed to having everybody at large. Theoretically, you result in a more diverse body of elected officials. The response to that criticism is that historically it has not been possible to draw a majority-minority district in Virginia Beach of a single minority group, whether it be Black, Asian, Hispanic. Virginia Beach is, in fact, one of the most racially integrated cities in the country. That means our minority communities are spread out through our population. We are the least segregated, or one of the least segregated cities in the country, which means that it has just historically not been possible to concentrate a single minority group in a compact area and draw a district that was majority minority. The other piece of this, and the way the plaintiffs in the Holloway case have attempted to get around that reality, is to make the allegation that our African American community, our Hispanic community, and our Asian community are in fact politically cohesive. In other words, they support the same candidates and political causes. We don't believe that is an accurate assumption. We actually presented a fair amount of qualitative and quantitative evidence in court to suggest it wasn't the case that Hispanic, Asian, and Black voters in Virginia Beach are politically cohesive. But that is the quote-unquote workaround, because if you're drawing say one of 10 districts and you're lumping all minority individuals together, it's easier to draw that smaller circle than it would be with a single minority community. This is just a visual depiction of the America's least and most segregated cities, and that's segregated. What we mean is the population of our minority communities is concentrated versus diluted. Here, in Virginia Beach, our minority community is spread very evenly throughout our entire city. You will see that Virginia Beach is in the upper left-hand corner there as the second most integrated or second or least segregated cities in the country by this metric that was derived from Census Bureau data. Now, we've had a number of changes happen that were outside of this body's control. We've been litigating the Holloway case at the body's direction since 2017, and that was actually tried to the court in October of last year. And we were awaiting the court's opinion, at which time the General Assembly stepped in and passed two major changes to the city system. One is House Bill 2198. The other is House Bill 1890, also passed in the same form, and Senate Bill 1395, and that is known as the Virginia Voting Rights Act. The Holloway case, very briefly, involves two plaintiffs, Ms. Latasha Holloway and Ms. Georgia Allen. They were not originally, but are now represented by Campaign Legal Center, which is a public interest law firm from DC. The allegation in the case is that the city's at-large election system violates Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Again, this argument that it dilutes minority voting strength by allowing the entire population of registered voters in the city to vote for each of the 11 council members. And the allegation is that a combined group of Black, Hispanic, and Asian group voters coalesce around a particular set of candidates and political causes, and so they have a coalition that would allow the Voting Rights Act violation to be cured by combining minority voters of all kinds into one or more majority minority districts. The city at trial and before trial and continuously has disputed that central contention that that a group of Virginia Beach voters that are Black, Hispanic, and Asian are politically cohesive. We've also disputed a number of other aspects of the case, and there was that bench trial conducted back last fall. While that case was pending with the court before the court ruled, the General Assembly passed two bills that were signed by the governor. The first is House Bill 2198, and it makes clear that notwithstanding any other provision of law, which in this case is your city charter, the member elected from each district or ward shall be elected by the qualified voters of that district or ward and not by the locality at large. That language by itself, without further change from the General Assembly, means that even without the Holloway case, your body would be elected next time with your 7 residence districts being wards. So no further action would be necessary for that change to have legal effect over the election of this body after January 1, 2022. And this provision is equally applicable to school boards, including Virginia Beach. The other change is this Virginia Voting Rights Act, also adopted by the General Assembly in 2021, goes into effect in July this year. At-large method of election shall not be imposed in any manner that impairs the ability of members of a protected class to elect candidates of its choice or its ability to influence the outcome of an election, and as a result of the dilution of the rights of voters who members of the protected class. That is essentially the allegation that we have in the Holloway case, but the way it's written is actually broader and seems to put a target on the back of at-large elections and localities as kind of being suspect going forward. and also essentially taking away some of the Jingles v. Thornburg defenses that are available under the Federal Voting Rights Act. So it would be easier to establish a state law Voting Rights Act violation going forward than it would be in the federal court case that we've been defending for you since 2017. It also establishes a preclearance process for the state attorney general, so there would have to be sign-off by whoever is your next attorney general on any system changes or district changes that would come out of the 2020 census results. Also, this is applicable to school boards to the same effect it is to councils. So, the combined effects of the General Assembly actions are that even without the Holloway case, your current system is changing for 2022. There are 7 residence districts that are no longer residence districts. They are now ward districts without any further action of the General Assembly. Citizens will not be electing all 11 council members going forward. Under your new status quo system, separate and apart from the case, citizens would be able to vote for 5 members, for the mayor, the 3 at-large members, and the 1 ward member. And essentially, the 3 at-large districts are subject to further challenge if they were to exist into the 2022 election and beyond, given the new Virginia Voting Rights Act. Holloway case, again, the opinion came down only after the General Assembly had acted. It was a strongly written opinion. It says that by preponderance of the evidence, the plaintiffs demonstrated that the at-large system of elections for the Virginia Beach City Council denies Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians equal access to the electoral and political process in contravention of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It prohibits further elections being conducted under the current system, and it told the parties that they were to prepare and submit the plaintiff's attorney's fees and any defense rebuttal to the plaintiff's attorney's fees and costs so the court can determine how much to award. And then there's obviously a remedy phase to come that has not yet occurred. The court has said, your current system is in violation. I'm going to take more evidence on what new system springs forth. As we speak, the district court has thrown out your election system. The plaintiffs have indicated that their attorney's fees are approaching $4 million and will continue to grow in the remedy phase and the appeal phase. The city and the plaintiffs are both in the process of preparing remedial plans for the court that we would recommend, and the court would consider along with a court-appointed special master. And the city has also filed its notice of appeal, and after this body's direction, is pursuing the appeal. And that is something that will occur on a parallel track to the remedy phase. When we talk about remedies, the functional issue in the case is at-large districts are deemed to imperil this minority coalition's ability to elect candidates of choice. So the remedy for that is some form of ward or super ward system that would take away the at-large nature of your elections. In a residence district, as we've discussed before, the candidate themselves must reside in the district, but the voters of the entire city get to vote for that representative. In a ward, each candidate has to live in the district that they are running from, but they also are only elected by the voters of that same district. A super ward is just a larger ward that can be overlaid on the same map in a way to allow people to have input on more than just 2 council members. And in this example I'm about to show you, there would be input on the 3 council members. Everybody in the city would vote on the mayor. They would vote for their ward district member, and they would vote for their super ward district member. So in doing that, it is a way of allowing the citizens to at least have input on 3 of their 11 council members, when historically they've had obviously input on all 11. If this were the city of Virginia Beach, and it intentionally is not, because the focus here is conceptual. It's not on the actual drawing of maps at this moment in time. We have a population of approximately 450,224 individuals. Going forward, all of the systems that we expect the court to consider would involve an at-large mayor. And so all 450,000 citizens would be able to vote, if registered, to vote for the mayor. If we were to go to a 10-district ward system, and we expect that this will be the plaintiff's proposed remedy to the court, then we would divide the city up into 10 roughly equal population districts, each having approximately 45,000 people in them. And then, again, the voters who live in District 4 would vote for their District 4 representative, but not in any of the other 9. They would also, of course, vote for their mayor. If you were to do a 7-ward, 3 super ward system, you would have, instead of 44,000 resident districts, you would have approximately a 64,000 resident district. There would be 7 districts dividing the city. And then if you were to overlay 3 super wards onto it, then you would have the city split three other ways and elect super ward reps from a group of 150,000 residents in that portion of the city. So, for example, a person who lived on the western edge of the city would vote for Super Ward 2 and vote for regular Ward 4. So you can see how that overlays. What comes next? Again, we're proceeding on a 2-phase path. In the trial court, we are in the remedy phase, and as part of that, the court has ordered the parties to submit each of their proposed remedial plans to the court by July 1st, and we are, as your counsel, working on that. Court has indicated it intends to appoint a special master, which is a special advisor to the court itself, to review the plans and implement a remedy, and we expect that to happen sometime approximately fall of 2021. The remedy, and what we understand from the plaintiffs and what we have been looking at ourselves, will involve creation of 3 what we call minority opportunity seats, either from wards or super wards, with only the mayor at large. And we have indicated, as you have directed us, that the city will actively participate in the remedy phase, and that includes proposing a system and remedial maps, includes seeking public input on the preferred system, which is why I'm here addressing you all publicly today. And it will involve proposing a minimum of 3 minority opportunity districts, whether that be in a 10-ward system or in a 7/3 system, which we've also looked at as a possibility. If there's a remedy imposed by the court prior to the release of the 2020 census data, which we do not expect to be released until August or later of this year, then the boundaries of the court's remedial plan would need to be adjusted with the census changes. And of course, as that proceeds, there will also be the attorney's fees amount determination. At the same time, we are proceeding smartly towards perfecting the appeal and having that heard. The appellate issues that the court will, the Fourth Circuit will be asked to consider include whether minority groups may, as a matter of law, be combined to assert a combination or a coalition claim under Section 2. The Supreme Court has not ruled on that. The Fourth Circuit has suggested in what we call dicta that it does not approve of such coalition claims, but it's never formally ruled on that. And the other circuits in the country are split. Additionally, there's the factual question of whether the plaintiffs, in fact, proved that these 3 minority groups in Virginia Beach are, in fact, politically cohesive, which we don't believe they did. And then there are additional legal issues on an appeal involving standing, mootness, and ripeness that we anticipate being set forth to that court. As we've told you before, appellate outcomes are not certain. They are highly uncertain. We cannot predict to you what will happen in the Fourth Circuit or in the Supreme Court of the United States if it goes that far. They are expensive. They are time-consuming. And we are also aware keenly that you have a city council general election in November 2022. And by virtue of that, candidates for those seats, whatever those seats end up being, would need to know the system at least 60 or more days before the usual second Tuesday in June filing deadline for their signature petitions. And so we are working aggressively to attempt to expedite the appeal and get a ruling from the Fourth Circuit before we are in the heat of an election season, next spring. In the Court of Appeals, the court has already given us a briefing schedule with our brief due in June 22nd, I believe, and they then follow a briefing schedule where the appellees in this case, the plaintiffs, would file a brief, and then we'd file a reply brief. We expect briefing to be completed no later than early August. At that time, we intend to seek oral argument and a decision from the court in an expedited fashion in hopes of having a decision from the Fourth Circuit early in the first quarter of 2022. If the city were to prevail, you could seek to redraw your maps using census data, but using the 7-ward 4-at-large system, understanding that there is a possible future challenge as to at-large seats, but they would not be illegal as a matter of law initially. As prevailing parties on the appeal, it's possible for the plaintiffs to appeal that ruling to the United States Court of Appeals. And certainly, if it goes that far and the appellate court has sustained the trial court ruling, there is some likelihood that your 2022 election would be held under the remedial plan that the district court orders while the matter is also winding through the appellate system. We've touched on this briefly, but the school board is not a party to the Holloway case. The court has made clear that its ruling refers only to city council elections. At the same time, the city charter sets forth that school board members are elected in the same manner and according to the same schedule as council members. And again, we'll note that 2198 House bill changes the school board's residence districts to wards without anything happening in the litigation. What we see as the most likely result is that the system that gets adopted by the district court will be applied to the school board practically, and that leaves ambiguity as to what happens to the 11th member. And for you, your mayor is one of your 4 at-large. For the school board, all 4 at-larges are regular seats, and then the body elects the chair. So that is an ambiguity that at least we would want to clarify most likely by going to the General Assembly for a charter change once we know what the new city council system looks like. We are well down the path of public information and receiving input on the remedial plan that the city will present to the court. This is our second in-person briefing to you as a body, a public briefing. We've reached out and been available either to present to or answer questions to presentations made for Virginia Beach Vision, for the Hotel Authority, Restaurant Authority, Central Business District, Chamber of Commerce, and the Farm Bureau Local Board. We will continue to be available for any presentations or town halls or anything else that any of the 11 of you wish to hold between now and, I guess, now July 1st would be when we'd submit the remedy. We also have public hearings, so you can receive public input on both June 8th, next Tuesday, and June 15th, the following Tuesday. And then we've done a direct mailing. I believe that mailer went on May 26th. It being a mail function, it takes a little while for it to hit mailboxes, but that's out there just alerting folks to these changes and to drive them to the website so they can learn more about it. And then there are a number of other activities that the city does through its communications staff to put the word out that the city is seeking input on the remedy that the city will recommend to the court on July 1st. And with that, I'll take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Mr. Tower.
Thank you, Chris. Good job as always. Any information you could give the public and us about how a special master is chosen?
The court has given the parties the opportunity to recommend a special master. He doesn't have an obligation to follow that, but he's at least indicated that they will be considered. We are working with outside counsel to develop a recommendation for a special master. And then there are a number of folks who just around the country are routinely appointed as special masters in these types or similar cases. And
Bill
so-
Spong's not with us anymore. We
I
can't
miss
use
Bill
him.
Spong very much. He used to be my
I do too.
boss.
I do too. This is a question I've got talking to another lawyer about potential constitutional infirmities of the Virginia Voting Rights Act.
There have been issues considered. I can't tell you that that has been a path we've been,
Right.
as your counsel, pursuing, but I have heard that there are concerns about whether the sweeping nature of that might in some way undermine due process or equal protection. I mean, certainly when you are directing as a matter of state law that districts be racially gerrymandered, there's an interesting question about whether the remedial value that you get perhaps out of a federal Section 2 remedy is a compelling state interest. Is the state interest, especially on a squishier or more amorphous standard, is that something that could in fact be subject to challenge? I think we'll just have to see where it goes.
One more, Mr. Mayor, please. Could you explain how if we are not satisfied with the remedy, we are obviously already appealing the case in chief. If we're not satisfied with the remedy that the court imposed, how does that, and choose to appeal it, how does that appeal get handled in relative to the case in chief?
Sure, and you would have every right to appeal the remedy just as you would to appeal the merits decision on liability. It would probably be a different timeline, but it would be, depending upon what the court does and what the legal issues were presented at the time, that would certainly be a viable additional appeal or alternative appeal if you ended up not prevailing or further pursuing the merits appeal.
Indeed, you would not need to appeal the case in chief to appeal the remedy itself.
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to get that out for various interests. Thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, Mr. Rouse and then Ms. Henley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just like the public to know, I am not of the majority of council who are choosing to appeal this case. I hold a different view for different reasons, but that's not to say that my colleagues and I are far apart on this. But here are the reasons briefly why I choose not to support an appeal. First of all, before the litigation, before the ruling came in for the Holloway case, before House Bill 2198, before House Bill 1890, before all of those things came into play, there was a voter referendum put forth before council of August of 2020 to ask the public what they thought on the voting system in Every City, Virginia Beach. That referendum resolution was brought forth by Councilwoman Jessica Abbott, who isn't here right now. But that was brought forth to give the voters a say on whether or not what they thought about the voting system. Now, that was whether people supported it or whether they didn't like it. Regardless of the fact, you all, the public, deserved a right and a say-so in the matter. That referendum failed in a 6-5 vote of August of 2020. So for that reason, number one. Number two, regardless if we are successful in appeals, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is no going back to the current or old system that's in place because of state legislations, House Bill 2198 and House Bill 1890. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. So that begs the question, why appeal? And lastly, but certainly not least, the total cost to taxpayers. This case is already going to cost us upwards $3 to $5, $7 million. The number's going up. And so an appeal is only going to add to that price tag. And I could think of 5 to 7 million other reasons, ways to really utilize the cost associated with appealing this case, starting with flooding. So with those reasons alone, I choose not to support an appeal.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Henley.
I'm not going to use my valuable time to rebut those three issues, but at some point I would love to. I think the case as it came down is factually and legally flawed, and that's why I think we really have to appeal it. As far as the maps, and in the presentation the other night that Mark Stiles did a great job before the Farm Bureau Board, there was a lot of concern about how to explain this whole concept to the public because it's so complicated, and that it would help a lot if people could see maps. And of course, we're not going to have maps for quite some time, and it's certainly almost not fair to put out maps that are absolutely not anything, except what you just drew does give people the idea of what we're talking about in 10 districts and 3 at large. If we were able to absolutely say, these are not it, because they make no attempt to make minority-majority districts, which I'm sure those as they are drawn don't. But it would give people the idea of the concept of 10 and 3, even though, so is that something that we can do just to help explain to people what we're talking about? But then when we're talking about having to draw them to make them minority-majority districts, you're going to get into some extensive gerrymandering. And that's a problem because I think people have pretty much been led to believe that that's not legal. So how do we address this whole issue of the maps and how to explain it to people?
Sure, and the graphics that we put together for this presentation were attempting to address that very question. And so that presentation will be posted on the Holloway website, or it's actually the Election Changes website, which is on the Virginia Beach main page. And so I think we can also probably highlight those 3 or 4 in some type of graphic that visualizes it and gives you a tutorial. I know Julie Hill's been doing a lot of really good work with us on that. So we can circle back to them to make that a more visible part of the website. In terms of maps, that is a part of the conversation that we're not having as of today. But certainly we are going to need to have that conversation and likely in advance of July 1st, because we anticipate presenting something to the court for its consideration, and we will need obviously your input on that as well as your desire to have public feedback on it.
But just to be clear in my own mind, if we're presenting something as a possible remedy to the court, we're going to have to make them minority-majority.
That's correct. What we would attempt to do,
even though we know they are gerrymandered.
well, there's a narrow needle to thread where if there's a found Section 2 violation under federal law, there is arguably a compelling interest in drawing a district using race as a predominant factor when you otherwise would absolutely not be able to do that. And so in presenting a remedy, we would look to try to thread that needle and both accomplish traditional redistricting criteria such as compactness and communities of interest and not pairing incumbents if we can avoid it, but then also, yes, present 2 or 3 minority opportunity districts that, by virtue of them being minority opportunity districts, have some input that is racial or demographic, I should say, in drawing of those districts.
Okay, anyone else? Mr. Moss and then Mr. Jones.
Just some observations. People may or may not know several states have sued the Census Bureau, the federal government, over the timeline of delivery. My latest understanding is that they're in negotiation with Justice Department to deliver on 16th of August, or those court cases will proceed. But also what was revealed in all that discussion was, and I shared this with the city attorney earlier this morning, that the Census Bureau has injected noise into the census block data because of the great computational power today that does exist, that people could actually track back the census data to the household and possibly to the individual that generated it. So that in fact, the strategy that we have had, which is to look at the larger than block data, is clearly the strategy that is now being proposed to the initial boundaries and then going to the block data to do the refinement, where traditionally we've started from the block data and worked up. But apparently the noise that's injected, if you start from the block level up, you get a different answer because of the purposeful contamination of that data. You get bad answers. So the strategy we've taken has proven to be, a good one in light of that evolving information about the census data. Nice that they're protecting our privacy, but it also generates other issues. But I just wanted to make people aware of that. That's probably not something that the average person tracks, but that will influence
That is
our case.
absolutely a big current issue in front of the Census Board and the demographers and the map drawers who are trying to get their arms around what the data is going to mean when it comes out. But you're right that we have 100 precinct boundaries right now, and so when we sit down and try to draw some maps for your consideration, we're starting at the precinct level and seeing how can we minimize splitting precincts, how can we avoid drawing at the block level for that reason, among others.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Based on your comments and on your presentation on the screen here, I wasn't clear. Does the state law specifically address the issue of the election of the mayor?
It does not. But I think there's a general assumption that a mayor can be at large, that the mayor's position as a unique position to an entire city is not challenged by either HB. He was not elected from a ward or a district, so House Bill 2198 clearly doesn't apply. On the others, it's just a general sense that at-large seats are challengeable in the future if there is this issue of vote dilution or not being able to influence the outcomes of elections to elect minority candidates of choice.
So is that one of the issues we need to get cleared up with the state, or?
I don't see that as a big issue as to the mayor. I think everybody every locality in the state has a mayor, or some of them choose them by the body, not by direct election. But I don't take that Virginia Voting Rights Act language to directly impair a mayor position. Mark, do you have different thoughts on that?
No, I think definitionally where you have a single official that's being elected, like a mayor or a governor or, an attorney general, those are by definition single-member districts elected at large, and I don't believe any of the state law or the federal law would impact the ability to elect those single-shot positions at large.
So the state law requires 7-4 though, doesn't it?
Well, the one state law says the 7 that you already have as residence districts are now ward districts.
Okay.
And then it's done. That it's accomplished its purpose and there's no further impact. Then we get to the Virginia Voting Rights Act, which doesn't say anything precisely, but it says that if you're going forward with at-large positions, which if you prevail on appeal, you would have the ability to go forward with your 3 at-large positions on the 7-4 system, those 3 spots would be subject to a later challenge under the Virginia Voting Rights Act.
Thank you.
Sir.
All right, anyone else? Ms. Wooten.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ensure, as always, when we reach out to the public concerning pertinent issues, and this is, of course, one of great magnitude, wanted to make sure that we reach out to other areas that I would say not the normal way that we reach out. In terms of, other organizations outside of the like churches and other organizations, because they also, they may not travel in the same commissions or committees, but they still would like to know what's going on with the voting system. And so I just would implore you and the city, the staff, to ensure that you go beyond and reach out to those churches, as I will be doing that in other organizations as well, to ensure that if they would like a hearing or, excuse me, a briefing, that they do have access to that information. Also, I would like to also let others know that I have been speaking with residents in the city, and they are concerned about the appeal. Mainly, it is the taxpayers' dollars, the additional resources that are going into the appeal that they're concerned about. And so, for that reason, you know, I do not support the appeal. That has a big area to do with it, because it is additional taxpayers' money going out to address this matter. However, on the other side, I do understand that the city has an option to appeal because of not being able to get a amicable resolution. So I do understand the city's position in that regard. So I just wanted to voice, you know, the feedback that I've heard and my concerns regarding the appeal. And thank you for your continued update and information that you've provided us.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Okay, anyone else? Ms. Wilson?
I have a question. I hadn't really thought about this before. And in your professional opinion, all of the other court cases that preceded this, you know, you always hear precedents is very important in law. Does any of the precedents of those other court cases have any effect in this case, do you think?
The key legal issue in the case is whether the Voting Rights Act at the federal level is written in a way that contemplates combining different minority groups into one coalition for purposes of accomplishing Section 2's broader mission. And on that issue, literally, the Fourth Circuit, the circuit we live in, has not issued an opinion or a ruling on that topic, but there is one case where it said, kind of as an aside, that it didn't think the law was intended for that. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has also not addressed that issue. So for purposes of the two courts that are over this district court, it's an undecided thing. But you do have the Sixth Circuit saying that you can't have coalition claims, and you have two or three circuits saying you can have coalition claims. So that's where you get what they call a split in the circuits, and that's often a harbinger for the Supreme Court of the United States wanting to make a decision. No guarantees. You know, they grant such a small percentage of cases that are brought before them, but this is a unique legal question that hasn't been answered by them, and that the circuits below them have split on.
Okay. Anyone else at this point? Chris, once again, thank you, and Mr. Stiles, once again, your remarkable staff, you know, great stuff. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, at this point, Mr. Duhaney, we have a manager's briefing.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, at this time, the planning department is going to provide a brief update on the stormwater management regulations and also the Stormwater Appeals Board. The goal today is to kind of review the legislation that's been adopted going on a year now, and to talk about some feedback that we've heard from the development community and some changes and adjustments we intend to make that will increase our responsiveness, timeliness, and engagement, but not water down the legislative intent.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council, myself and my staff will be presenting, as Mr. Haney had noted, some information for you regarding the stormwater regulations. First, starting off with the preliminary stormwater analysis that you see during some of the reviews of discretionary approvals, as well as many of you have heard about from outside as well as internal customers about the stormwater management review process based on the new regulations, and also regulations as they changed over time. and also to bring you an update about the Stormwater Appeals Board and how we want to make updates to that board to help facilitate better movement in the process. First off, I do want to thank Council for the positions for the Engineering Tech for the Development Services Center to assist us with trying to make sure that we can continue to provide timely service in the review process. As you'll see in the presentations today, it's not necessarily the timeliness of the turnarounds as much as it is the number of turnarounds because of the process and how developers are trying to meet the requirements for the stormwater management requirements. Before I hand off the presentation to Carrie Buchholz and Seth Edwards, I just want to introduce them. Carrie Buchholz, who you've known for a while as the Development Services Center Administrator. She's been up and spoken to you many times regarding stormwater issues and other site planning issues. She is a professional landscape architect as well as has been professionally recognized by the Virginia chapter of the American Landscape Architects, Society of Landscape Architects, for her public service and her meeting the furthering kind of the profession. As well as you've probably heard of Seth Edwards. Seth Edwards is one of our main points of contact for the civil engineering plan review portion. He is the one where the rubber meets the road as far as making determinations on the regulations and requirements that were adopted most recently with the Public Works Design Standards Manual in, last year, but also trying to make sure that we meet the intent of the Public Works Standards and Specifications Manuals previous to that. Seth has the hard job of supervising our civil engineers in the Development Services Center who do those reviews, as well as handling many of the high-profile projects to help get them to the finish line through the process. I want to make sure that we call them out because they have significant experience both in the public sector and the private sector, with both of them doing design experience. In Seth leaving us at one point in time to go to Northern Virginia and then coming back to us and taking over as our engineering manager. So their experience in the private sector is one that we utilize and try to lean on as we try to move forward and try to come up with solutions to many of the issues that you've probably heard. So with that, I will go ahead and hand this over to Carrie Buchholz to go over the preliminary stormwater analysis. This presentation is 3 presentations put together, so it is a little lengthy, but we do hope this information is very useful to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. All right, I'm going to kick this off, and we're going to start talking about preliminary stormwater analysis first. Like Bobby mentioned, these are the analysis that are often attached to projects that come before you for discretionary approvals. After these first 2 sections of our presentation, we'll pause and ask for some feedback and get your thoughts. All right, we're going to cover the history of how preliminary stormwater analysis came to be, what was the intent at adoption, and how these requirements have changed over time. We're also going to take a deepish dive into a case study and show you a behind-the-scenes look into the stormwater models and cover feedback that we've heard from both the development community and some feedback that we have as staff. In 2016, the update of the comprehensive plan included language for special drainage considerations for projects specifically in the Southern Rivers watershed as it relates to high groundwater, poorly draining soils, and high tailwaters associated with wind tides. As I mentioned, it was specific in reference to the Southern Rivers watershed, and it strongly encouraged preliminary analysis be submitted with the discretionary applications that come before City Council, so a rezoning, a conditional use permit. The intent was that the analysis evaluate both on-site and off-site flooding and any flooding impacts that might be associated with the proposed development. In 2016, initially we were requesting 15 to 30% designs so that we could check for major flooding concerns and ensure that the stormwater facility was sized appropriately. We wanted, if someone was coming before you to seek a conditional rezoning for a 20-lot subdivision, we wanted to make sure that that BMP was appropriately sized, that they could achieve the 20 lots, that they weren't going to get 15 lots. So it made sense that we were checking at that 15 to 30% design. It's a size of a project or the scope similar to what the city might do for a feasibility study if you're checking for potential hurdles for a project and scoping some preliminary costs. In 2016, in response to heightened awareness of the city's susceptibility to flooding And the requests for more information kept coming from the preliminary stormwater analysis, so we could respond to City Council's questions, Planning Commission's questions, citizens' questions. We had to amp up what we were looking for in the preliminary stormwater analysis. At the same time, we were hoping that the Public Works Design Standards Manual would be on board and adopted within about 6 months. Our stormwater models were coming online, so at this time we started requesting that preliminary stormwater analysis include analysis for sea level rise as well as increased rainfall. So what is a preliminary analysis? It's just that, it's preliminary. It's somewhere between a rough draft and a final design. It is typically constructed using GIS type data, city planimetric data. At this time, it's not customary that a developer would have a full-blown site survey with topographic information. They customarily wouldn't have invested yet in a geotechnical report to tell us where groundwater is located. So this is a screenshot here using our city GIS data with, you'll notice we're going to talk about this case study. It's roughly a 2-acre site. There's really limited detail that is at the hands or at the disposal of the development community at this point in time. All right, for our case study, we're going to dive into a project that you saw in December of 2019. They came before you for a conditional use permit for self-storage mini warehouse. They are located on Fisher Arch in the Princess Borough development in the Princess Anne district. So this is the layout that staff saw, my staff, DSC staff saw for the preliminary stormwater analysis. At this stage in the design, the building is placed where it's probably going to land. The parking is in the right spot. They have the right number of spaces, and they've started a preliminary pipe layout. They've sized the BMP based on the information that they received from the stormwater model or from GIS data. They placed the BMP, but at this point, they're not designing any other element of the site. We're really just focusing on stormwater here. We're going to compare the preliminary analysis to the site plan just so you have an idea of the matter of scale of what is preliminary versus what is a full site plan. So a preliminary package for this project is 94 pages in length. As for timeline, the initial submittal of just the stormwater piece, I'm not talking about the timeline for the whole application, but just for the stormwater analysis, it was submitted to us in October of 2018. We had 3 iterations. We approved it or recommended approval to the staff planner in late May of 2019. This timeline shows you from submittal to acceptance was a total of 240 days. 56 of those days were spent in our purview, in our review, and 184 of those days were spent either in revision or in the queue of the consulting engineer. So comparing now to the site plan. So this is the current layout for the site plan. You'll see that the BMP is pretty much the same size and the same location. The pipe network, which is shown in the bold black lines, has shifted around a bit so that they can accommodate on-site connections to the public utilities in Fisher Arch, so they can navigate around franchise utilities. But pretty much the stormwater system is in the same place, it just includes more detail. For a matter of scale, the analysis package for this project, which is still under review, is 242 pages. So we're doubling the amount of information. For the timeline, like I mentioned, this one's still under review, submitted to us in August of 2020. We're on the 4th review cycle that came to us in May of 2021. So total duration when we ran our report and prepared the PowerPoint was 291 days. 132 of those days they've been with us, and 159 days has been with the engineering consultant. So you'll see that because we did a preliminary stormwater analysis, it hasn't necessarily streamlined or shortened a process at all for a site plan. We want to give you an idea of not just the layout and the paperwork that we'll see and push with a preliminary analysis, but also what does the model look like. So for this project, they utilize the city's master drainage models, and a submodel is given to the consultant. The submodel is kind of shaded here in green. It's 600 acres. So even though our project site is about 2 acres, they're analyzing the stormwater within 600 acres. This submodel is created by the Public Works Stormwater Engineering staff. They decide how big it is, where the connection points are. They give that to us. We transmit it to the developer. This 600-acre piece is just a larger, it's a small section of the larger Asheville Bridge Creek and Dam Neck Basin, and you'll see it contains a lot of data. It has 123 storage nodes, so places where water will gather, 170 junctions, whether they be structures or manholes, and 450 sticks of pipe. Before we move on to the next slide, I just want to focus on the scale of this project because the next slide will zoom in to our specific site for this project. So now we've zoomed in. The information that was plentiful in this 600-acre drainage basin has been diluted a bit as we get down to the site level. Our stormwater master models contain pipes that are 24 inches and larger. So you can see here, shown in yellow, the trunk system that's in Fisher Arch, the trunk system that runs behind Tractor Supply and the daycare there. There's a grouping of junctions and overland flows that converge at the corner of Anderson's Home and Garden Showplace. So this is what the framework model is that we give to developers. This is how it comes to them. The engineering consultant now has to build the model for their site. They have to fill in any data gaps that might exist. So you can imagine on a site that doesn't have a whole lot on it, there are some significant data gaps that they might need to fill in, and then they need to build their stormwater system into the model. This next slide shows you the submitted model for the preliminary analysis. So the site that we have is 2 acres. It's in a larger 10-acre drainage area. They've now split that 10-acre area into 2. They added 3 structures, 5 pipes, and the BMP. At this point, we're modeling how does their BMP, how does their stormwater system plug into that overall 600-acre network. It's too soon to evaluate on-site stormwater. We don't necessarily need to know how does the raindrop in the far corner of the site get to that BMP, what's the size of that pipe. It's too soon to know that because we don't have site-specific topographic information yet. So this is the level of detail that we're seeing for about most of our preliminary stormwater analysis. We're going to compare that. So we'll go back. Here we're at a preliminary analysis. The next slide, this is the stormwater model that we review for a site plan. So our 10-acre drainage area has now been split 14 different ways. We've added 15 structures, 17 pipes, and the BMP. It's at this point that we have site-specific survey data, so we need to know how each raindrop falls and how it gets to the BMP, and are the pipes that carry it sized appropriately so we can ensure there's no impacts to the building, no flooding of the building. And we're looking for all the other things that aren't associated with stormwater as well with this site plan design. We want to make sure that we don't have conflicts with utilities, both private and public utilities. So when we talk about stormwater modeling, they contain an immense amount of data. And when coupled with a GIS type of system, you can generate a lot of really good mapping, most of it on a citywide scale. I'm sure you've seen them that have been prepared by the Stormwater Engineering Center, showing flooding maps, what it looks like with sea level rise and without sea level rise. But for a site design, we're not looking at maps. We're looking at information like what is shown on your screen. We're looking at inputs. So each one of those nodes, junctions, drainage areas has to have a multitude of information populated within that stormwater model. For example, for pipes, we need to know how long are they? What's the material? What's the slope? What's the size? There's a lot of information that has to be filled in. And the engineers have to check if we give you a stormwater model that shows some of this information already filled in, they need to verify that it's accurate. So they may have to go back and update our model, plus build in their new information. On the other side of the screen, for each drainage area, if you remember, we had 10-acre drainage area, then we went to 2 different drainage areas, then to 14. Each one has input data that needs to be input and then verified by both staff and the review engineer, or the consulting engineer. For the drainage areas, we need to know what's the soil characteristics, the impervious cover, the shape and the flow of how water goes across that specific drainage area. Is there a slope associated with it, et cetera. So if you think back to that 600-acre submodel with all of those different bits of information, you can imagine that there's hundreds and thousands of rows of information that we have to review, which looks a lot like this. So in our SWIM software, our stormwater modeling software, there's a comparison tool that aids both the designer and staff in comparing what was to what is proposed. So on the left side of the screen is the pre-development modeling output. On the right side of the screen is the post-development modeling output. We're checking the lines of data. Everything that's white has stayed the same. Anything that's yellow has changed, with the darker orange color highlighting the specific value that has changed. And then anything green is something that's been added. So we're checking, links, nodes, inputs, all of those things when we're reviewing stormwater models. We're not looking at a dynamic map or a more illustrative picture of how water flows across the site. We don't see a BMP filling up and emptying. We see these very complex calculations. So next, we'll talk about feedback for just a minute. I'm sure you've heard, we hear that there is some enhanced risk that the development community feels they have with the stormwater analysis. There, of course, is no guarantee on approval for their discretionary application. You've seen from our timeline that these take time. They are not fast to get right, often taking 3 or 4 and sometimes 5 or 6 review cycles. So we've heard from a developer that you might put down 6 months of earnest money to hold a project, but you just simply can't get anything approved in that time. So there's a time delay, there's a cost delay, and associated with not only the carrying costs that have to be spent, there's an engineering value. So the project that you saw carried somewhere in the $20,000 range to be completed in engineering billable hours. And what we're seeing is that information that's done at that preliminary analysis, because we don't have site-specific data and geotechnical information, if that BMP moves a little bit, all of those inputs have to be redone. So the investment in the preliminary stormwater analysis doesn't translate into a cheaper, faster, anything when it comes to a site plan design. The last bullet here mentions that it doesn't follow standard engineering practices. I would say that a preliminary analysis, if it's truly preliminary, would follow a standard engineering practice. But to take it so far to where if we need to put an approval stamp on it or give you our absolute certainty that this project is approved, that would not follow standard engineering practices, since it's not designed in tandem with all the other site components, and it's not designed on the type of data that you would need to give it that refinement. So staff feedback echoes somewhat what we hear from the development community. These are time-consuming. We have, Bobby mentioned that we're adding a technician this year to our team, but we've absorbed the preliminary analysis on top of the work that is already in our hopper, ready for site planning review. We're not seeing that it's streamlining our process at all. It's not helping us when we get to site plan phase. And we often have the pressure to approve a project. In the earlier years, when we were putting these recommendation in the staff report, we would say that the project had the ability to comply, and we didn't give you a whole lot more information. But in the last year, we've tried to amp up what is included in the staff reports for stormwater impacts, where we're going over the drainage characteristics of the site, both pre and post development. We're giving you a general volume that the BMP is going to store, what they plan to do for stormwater quality. We're describing the outfall for you, which we feel very confident that we can continue to do if we maintain a threshold where we're keeping designs to about a 40 or 50% range. I would say the G's Group design was about a 40 or 50% design as far as it goes with stormwater management. Admittedly, as we've been trying to predict and get in front of and make sure we're capturing as much information, some of our preliminary analysis have gone further than that 40 or 50% range, but we're not seeing that it gives us any more confidence than if we would have had a preliminary analysis somewhere in that 40 or 50% range. All right, so concluding this portion, we just want to reiterate that the stormwater analysis should right-size development and check for impacts to the adjacent properties in the overall system. We'd like to have some feedback at some point if the stormwater section that we're currently providing in the staff report is sufficient as you're evaluating projects. And as we're also working on updates to the comprehensive plan. Right now, preliminary stormwater analysis are generally focused to the Southern Rivers watershed. Should that be expanded to other projects or other portions of the city? All right.
Okay, Mr. Moss?
Well, I have a number of questions and a number of comments, but I'm going to start off with the comment perspective first, but thank you for your presentation. As policymakers, we're interested in accountability. And I can't deduce from the presentation how what we're getting improves or degrades or puts at risk the current level of accountability that we need to have to the public, that when a project is ultimately, long after we've seen it, gets approved, and I'm going to come back to an example because you didn't use this one in your presentation, that we are responsible for the result. So I'm very much interested, Mr. City Manager, is trying to understand how the council's ability as a policymaker, when we get less information, and I'm not sure it's even information, data. Information's a whole nother level of knowledge, and I'm not sure we ever get much information, but lots of data, that we are, in fact, able to do our accountability function effectively in the eyes of the people we work for. And this presentation didn't leave me with the sense of comfort if I'm better off, worse off, or we should take some risk on accountability in order to be more flexibility to industry. I don't have an appreciation for that. But I do have an example that we didn't have here, so I often think if you can say how we're going to do it, how would it have improved something that in the past didn't work well? And I'm sure you know which one I'm going to mention, the Thalia BMP. So I would like, I'm not going to go through that all here today, but I would like to know how this would have resulted in a different answer than the one that we got, which was a dry MP was the right answer, and it turned out in effect that a wet BMP was the right answer. And council approved a dry BMP, which became a big issue. So I'd like to understand how this process would allow for that. But my bigger question is one that I raised in a meeting with Mr. Williams and with Mr. Tahan, is we have this, I think we have a very valid, my colleagues, macro model, because we've looked at it, validated against the floods. But when you go from macro anything to micro, that's a huge leap and requires a whole new set of data, a whole new set of validation. And I don't believe to this date we have ever validated that our micro level application. So let me walk you through. You heard her say we went from the big picture, the watershed, which we say does a good job. We look at the rain events and what the model predicted matches. We then scooped it down to a smaller segment. Then we scooped it down again to another smaller segment, and then we went to the site. Each time you are doing that, that's an extrapolation of a model beyond its valid capability. So how are we statistically validating because there's a whole science for the verification and validation and reliability of modeling. And I'm fairly certain our micro, we have not done that. And I suggested then to Mr. Williams that we need to be having a set of academics and a set of industry validating whether or not the requirements, independent of level of design, that the requirements that we're generating in terms of that make sense, because we're basing it on a unvalidated extrapolation to a level for which the model was not designed to do. So I think we have to answer that fundamental question, Mr. City Manager, and there is a way to answer it. And then lastly, as we look at this in the future, and I believe if you're making decisions that you don't have the granularity for, that's not a good thing, a representation. But it gets back to the accountability question. If we're going to be making preliminary decisions, because that's what we're making, then there ought to be somewhere in the process how you have the criteria. When is the what we got, and what do you plan to approve? And I'm going to go back to the one on Pleasure House Road where they talked about groundwater and how they were going to pump water back into the ground and what the layer, all that stuff wouldn't be coming to us under this system. We wouldn't be getting that level of detail, but those might have been material to the decision we make. So I don't know how provisional is that approval, Mr. City Attorney? When we're approving something, is that a conditional now approval? You know, and then ultimately, when we get the answer wrong, and we have a couple of cases of that, as you're well aware of, in the southern part of the city, where we approve something that was wrong, the people get the bill, but we're the ones that get held accountable, but we didn't do that final acceptance. So I'm very interested in if we're giving more flexibility on the front end to reduce cost and reduce time, which kind of makes sense, you get to the right level of granularity, where in there how's that risk being shared that what we approved, if we had all this full other knowledge, we wouldn't have gave the same answer? I mean, I'm not saying we wouldn't still change, but we ought to understand that now we're approving something like we did with Asheville Park. We didn't get asked if we wanted to accept Asheville Park or not, but now we have the $60 million bill to fix. And we didn't do a couple other things that we've gotten the bill for that we approved. So I'm looking for in this process, where are the accountability gates, which I haven't seen yet, and I want to see how this micro application that's putting workload on the development community is statistically valid, verified, and reliable, none of which those things have been met to date that I'm aware of. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Henley. Do you want to hear the other
We
presentation
can-
right now?
We can keep going, or we can answer questions however you would like to go. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, Seth will be
Yeah.
following up behind me to talk about
Okay.
site plan review.
Let's go ahead and proceed with that then.
Okay, sure. I'll get us started on the next section, and then I'll turn it quickly over to Seth to talk to you about stormwater plan review. So these are for projects that have already been here or didn't need to come here in the beginning. If it was a by right development, it didn't need a discretionary approval. We're going to cover the current concerns that we know are out there. We're going to talk briefly about plan review history and plan review changes that we've had over time. We're going to talk about regulation changes, what those impacts have looked like for development, and some process improvements that we have underway. So current concerns, much of it is the same, that reviews or the site planning process is too long. It's a lengthy process. As Bobby mentioned, we feel pretty confident in the review cycle. We have a similar model that many municipalities have, where you submit, we review, we send it back, and we go through this iteration. Most of our reviews happen in a timely fashion. However, it's the number of cycles that have to get you to approval. It used to take 2 or 3 submittals to have a duplex approved. Now it's not uncommon to have 5, 6, or more. For commercial sites, similarly, you would have 3 or 4 submittals for a commercial site prior to approval. Now we're in 5 or 6 or 7. So I know we are also working with permit stat, which will be kicking off soon. So as we're looking at our review timeliness, I also want to focus on how we can get our number of review cycles reduced. Staff, of course, is balancing compliance with the regulations, with the pressures to approve. So making sure that we're supporting economic vitality at the same time that we are protecting the adjacent property owners, protecting citizens, and the welfare of the city. So at this point, I'll kick it over to Seth to walk you through the timelines and give you a more in-depth look at the engineering review. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. So following up with some of the concerns that Carrie said, one of the concerns that we get the most, and I expect you all have heard too, is that we're moving the goalposts on stormwater design. And while we take great pride, my staff and I, to make sure that we're doing everything for every project right now to review the same. We review this project the same as that one and the same as that one. We've laid out several major events over the past 7 years that have changed considerably the way that we design stormwater projects and the way that we review them. It's gotten to the point where if you last designed a plan in 2013, came in right now in 2021, it would look like a different field that you're playing on. You're designing something different. And we're going to go through each of these changes in the upcoming slides. But just in brief, in 2014, we had the state adopt new stormwater regulations. 2016, we had the major storms, Matthew and Julia. 2017-18, we got our updated stormwater models and some new interpretations with Public Works. And then just last year, the council adopted the Public Works Design Standards Manual. So starting in 2014, the state delegated responsibility to us and localities throughout the state to become their own Virginia Stormwater Management Program. They told us to do this. Some of the smaller places opted out, but large cities all took it on themselves. This included technical design criteria updates that were passed in 2012, so the development community had time to figure this out and prepare. There were grandfathering statutes built in. Most people built their projects around that, and so we were still reviewing projects until recently using the old standards. We're still seeing a lot of the new hiccups from the 2014 regulations coming into play now and mixing with some of the new regulations that we've adopted. That changed the entire way that we review stormwater quality design, which with the Virginia runoff reduction method. That incorporated things like existing forests and the soil characteristics, as well as infiltration for the first time. And we used new quantity designs where energy balance, we've always checked the flow rate of how quickly stormwater leaves the site, but it also accounted for how much stormwater leaves the site. And they clarified the limits of analysis, which basically says you've got to do a check for impacts downstream and make sure your system works. 2016, we had the twin storms of Julia, then Matthew, that came through and showed some flooding areas of concern throughout the city. And it was especially concerning because a lot of these areas were not the older areas of the city, but some of them were more recently subdivisions that had been designed, approved, and constructed in the past 10 years. So based on that, we had to take a closer look within the city of how we are reviewing all these plans to make sure it's being done properly. I like to say it's a difference between reviewing from accuracy to viewing for correctness. In the past, we were reviewing for accuracy, relying heavily on the professional engineer's seal, and we were making sure that what he put down in his calculations was correct, he did the math correct, and checking to make sure that what he did meets the minimum regulations. So now we've started looking for correctness. It's not just, is the math correct, but are the underlying assumptions there correct? Making sure that we're getting an adequate comparison of pre-development to post-development. A good example is just saying how you're calculating how much water leaves an existing farm site. In the past, it might have said all that water just leaves, gets out quickly, and goes downstream to a single point, and right there, boom, there's a big impact of water. But we're going back and looking closer now, saying, oh, well, there's intermittent ditches throughout the farm. There's other things that would store water and slow it. There's berms built out, and things that are slowing down that water, and making sure we're getting a full accounting of that. We also had some updated interpretations from the Public Works specifications and standards. The DSC staff started working more closely with Public Works, especially the Stormwater Engineering Center, as they were working to update their master drainage study. We also got some updated interpretations to say that it always said that there's no impact to upstream, downstream properties, but we said that meant 0.00 increase in HGL, in water surface elevation. And, sorry, let me follow my notes here. And we also required that every site calculate a tailwater rather than using an assumption. So the tailwater, remember, that just means whatever impact the city system or any downstream receiving water body has on your design. So if the city stormwater model says that in Virginia Beach Boulevard, the water elevation is at 9 feet inside of our pipe system, that means whatever you're doing on your site has to start at 9 feet. So at the same time we made those interpretations, we also got the updated models from Public Works, and we're applying those higher tailwaters and checking for no upstream, downstream using our models as that information became available. Just last year, we had the Public Works Design Standards Manual. These first 3 items we've talked about quite a bit in the lead-up and discussion. Excuse me. The sea level rise data includes the 1.5 feet for most projects and then 3 feet for anything that's critical infrastructure. Increased rainfall amounts, we increased the NOAA published data by 20% to account for 10% of what we've already seen and 10% for what's going to happen based on projections in the next 20 years. And it also required the use of swim software for projects over 20,000 square feet, and that's for better compatibility and checks throughout our city stormwater model. And then the next couple items here are items that were built in and are having, I'd say, more impact than was expected during the discussions about the standards. First being the check storm. It's something that makes perfect sense. It's the 100-year storm to check and see what happens, make sure we're not making any flooding worse. And we also codified that 0.00 increase in flooding anywhere throughout the city. But as we've paired those 2 criteria with our updated models, we're seeing that a lot of the areas through the city demonstrate flooding. And so then we kick into the requirement of 0.00 increase in flooding. And that has the effect of largely making us check existing city infrastructure that was designed for a 2-year, 5-year, 10-year storm. Now we're checking it against a 100-year storm, and it's having pretty big impacts on design. We also have the requirement for finished floor elevations to be 2 feet above the 100-year calculated elevation in our models. We already had that built into our floodplain ordinance, but by putting it into including the model elevations, we've seen issues with already developed areas like Town Center, connecting into our city sidewalks and infrastructure while also maintaining ADA compliance. And we've had issues largely at the ocean front and smaller areas where you're building up a house now 3-4 feet higher than your neighbor, which makes sense in a lot of cases, but causes issues with design and extra fill. So we're going to start talking about some of the small scale issues and then talk about the large scale projects. For these small scale projects, the impacts to staff are that each review takes longer and it takes more submittals because it's more complex. That engineering is more complex, whereas the DSC for a long time was comprised of just engineer 1s and 2s. We've had to account for that and increase our training. For impacts to developers, it's taking more time and more money. It's the most common complaint that you can get, and it makes sense. It takes more time to develop it because it takes more reviews. It takes more money to develop it because the engineers are charging higher fees. And it takes more time in construction because it's a bigger facility. It's going to take more time to build and more money because it's bigger. That also leaves less developable space or the need to ask for more variances. And there's even impacts to the property owners, both the future owners of the project and the adjacent property owners. Often their entire yard will be filled with BMP. They have no free space for whatever they want, their gardens, their kids to play. And the new lots are built much higher, creating a potential risk for accidental flooding of the adjacent properties. So we're going to go through 3 case studies. We started with all projects these are all duplexes along the oceanfront area. This first one was a duplex that was approved in 2005 off of Holly Road. And you can see in the blue outline there was a small infiltration trench that was the entire design for stormwater management in 2005. 2014, we had 4 of those facilities that are about the same. These were bioretentions, but it's going to function fairly comparably to the infiltration. So it's a much bigger design, but there's still a lot more open space on the site. And this is one that we have now where you can see the entire rear yard and majority of the 4 side yards are filled up with a detention basin, and there's permeable pavement on both driveways. And this is actually a project that is still under review. With this whole facility, it still does not meet our criteria. So the impacts on development from a large scale are very comparable to the small scale. To staff, it's going to take longer and more cycles, more complex engineering. For the impacts to developers, it's still more time and more money with less developable space. One big change we've seen is their systems are going underground, which is more expensive to build and more expensive and difficult to maintain. So for our example of a large-scale development, we're referencing the City View 2 mixed-use development right near Town Center. Here's a picture of it being built at the corner of Bonnie and Constitution. We're only using one example here because it's a plan that came through and was designed and approved in 2011. And at that point, it had a single wet pond that had about 9,000 cubic feet of storage for stormwater. It came back in and for a revision, and in 2019, to meet the standards at the time, they still had the pond. It was a little bit smaller at 8,000 cubic feet, but they had to add an additional 24,000 cubic feet of underground storage in order to meet the stormwater requirements of 2 years ago. So we've got some process improvements in place. One of the first things we've done is we've tried to increase coordination to catch things as early as possible. At this point, we have about 20 to 25 pre-submittal meetings a month to discuss these concerns. At that point, we don't usually have a full detailed stormwater design, but we can give them any concerns that we see and any information from our master drainage model and discuss any potential pitfalls at the very beginning. We're also working on possible policy changes for small residential projects. We want to make it more functional for small-scale design, and we'll be reviewing these ideas with the development community over the next couple months. Essentially, we're trying to reduce the technical complexity while maintaining the city's resiliency and not having any impact to our compliance with state requirements. And we've also worked to eliminate the concern about overlap in decision-making. We've got an MOA, Memo of Agreement, between Public Works and Planning to say that planning has full review of projects under 5 acres, and Public Works will generally just review projects over 5 acres, which was decided to be the large-scale projects that would have impacts on the overall watersheds. And I know that was quite a bit of everything that's happened over the past 7 years, so wanted to take another break before the appeals board for discussion or questions.
Okay, anybody?
I do.
Yeah, Mr. Moss.
I'd like to go back to the picture of City View, with the second one, which showed the trench system. And plus, very nice presentation, was easy to follow, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
But the key point you mentioned here was, you said difficult to maintain. So this gets back, once again, Mr. City Manager, a point I mentioned before about accountability. The more sophisticated, which basically means something since the Romans, since they were pretty good about drainage, these systems then require, who does the oversight and how frequently are these things looked at? Because this is on an estuary, so clearly this is not just stormwater, but this is also water quality. So if these systems, like impervious pavement, if it's not vacuumed frequently, it ceases to work. So what is the oversight and the frequency of monitoring that allows us to ascertain that these systems are performing at the level of design? And are they over-designed to start with that allows for degradation to the standard, and that's when the maintenance takes place? Because those are all key things, because if we're not maintaining the functionality of the system, then the public benefit of allowing the increased density that took place by using these techniques is not achieved, but all the other effects of the density are experienced. So how is that built in? And this is another case where we approved one thing, which was the bigger pond when we saw it, but nonetheless, we're getting the same outcome, so we shouldn't be upset about the outcomes being achieved materially different, but we'd want to know how the alternative, because the ponds are easy to observe, but the stuff you don't see is not. How is that being, does the developer have to, like in some cases with settlements, have to hire an independent agency that reports directly to you, and they go out and monitor these sites? Are we having to pay for the monitoring of these sites? How is the quality and the functionality of those systems performing being validated over time?
So with every project that comes through that has a BMP facility like this, they sign a stormwater management facility maintenance agreement that gets recorded with the city. And so that requires the landowner to perpetually maintain. And on the plan, we have a set of maintenance responsibilities spelled out, a schedule, the time period that they're supposed to do that. So they will often contract that out to somebody who comes through and does the maintenance for them. And the city's Public Works Department has periodic inspections. I don't recall the time period offhand. So they have a constant obligation on the landowner to continue to perpetually maintain it, and the city has an obligation to periodically inspect and ensure that they have upkept their end of the bargain.
Well, what I've learned is what gets measured gets done, and what gets inspected is maintained. I take us only back to that Thalia BMP that was inspected in 2018, found to be non-performing. 2 years later, it's in the same non-performing status, inspected by the city, and no compliance. So while I certainly applaud your narrative representation, the reality of it is, if there isn't some active, scheduled, actual compliance plan, it's, trust but verify is a good expression. I'm asking is, I trust them to do it, but how are we verifying it? And I do not find that the historical approach of periodic inspections, which we generally aren't staffed up to do, but since people are choosing these alternative measures, something that has been used in industry when they've been caught not violating things and violating agreements, they have to sign consent decrees where they apply and hire independent people who have to do the inspections and then have to report the results to the government independent of the people that pay for it. I'm just saying we're only going to get the results that we want if we have meaningful inspection of the functional performance of these systems. Otherwise, we are going to look like we got something and we're not going to get the results. And that applies to the city as well. Because obviously, if we had been inspecting ourselves, there wouldn't have been 4 feet of dirt in those ditches in Princess Anne Plaza where a duck could stand in it. So clearly, I'm not just making observations of industry. I'm making observations of ourselves. So if we're going to go out and ask the public to spend a lot of money, Mr. Mayor and my colleagues, for a bond referendum to build to these standards for the main system that receives all this water, we should be equally vigorous making sure all these new systems that we put in place are inspected maybe biannually or whatever, and that they're performing. Because otherwise, we're going to spend a lot of money and we're not going to get the result we told the public we're going to provide them. And I don't think anyone has that as their intention, and I think people in Public Works do the best they can, but maybe we have to look at this differently on the magnitude, given what's at stake and how much money we're spending to fix a problem that we ourselves are partially, over time, council's responsible for. But I don't think you can just trust that the industry is going to do that, and we have examples, and probably more than just that one, that I have detailed knowledge of where that did not happen. So that's my observation, is great plans, where's the compliance plan?
Okay, anyone else? Okay, if I can make a comment, and once again, I really don't make it a habit of being critical about but constructive criticism is always a good thing. And about 9 years ago, we started a process improvement task force, and we tackled a number of issues, and one of which was a white paper, on the planning department, and some of the things that were there and some of the challenges. And I think a lot of the problems and frustrations, and once again, let me just say, Bob Scott, God rest him, was on our team, and he said, look, we have an obligation to make sure everything is safe, but we have to be practical, okay? And we got to see both sides. And a lot of the problems that have been going on are 10 years plus. And, I'm working with some folks that want to do business with the city, and have been frustrated periodically over a 10-year period, and still things are not resolved. And quite frankly, I think some of it is attitude, because some of the complaints we get are, it just seems some degrees of inflexibility. Maybe they're necessary, maybe they're not. But, just in terms of, I guess it's a lot of frustration. We're on the threshold, and once again, we're running out of area. We got to do a lot of infill right now. And, we're looking at bringing in businesses and other things. Took a friend of mine that lived on Whiting Lane in Sandbridge well over a year to get a permit to replace his house. And, I just find that, unbelievable. We hear complaints of folks from the Department of Retaliation and just inflexibility and, problems in that line. One specific thing, if I can bring up, I recently, referred a concern, I guess it was the GTS thing, the old golf course on Bird Neck Road. It was an old golf course. They had a couple cement pads there. And it was kind of my understanding, maybe you could walk it through, that, as a result of those cement pads, they had to do tremendous amount of time and expense in retrofitting, to accommodate. Can you walk me through that one?
Sure. For a quick response to the inflexibility part, I hope you understand that from a staff's perspective, we are a regulatory authority, so we have standards like the Public Works Design Standards Manual and DEQ's regulations that are codified by the state and our Stormwater Management Ordinance. And our requirement is to uphold those and make sure that every project goes through, is reviewed against those, and meets and exceeds those. Everybody wants us to have gray area, but if that gray area means you do not meet or exceed those standards, we don't have the authority to do that. So
But with due respect, when a project, is in the pipeline for 10 years and they keep on, I know it's frustrating to everybody. I'm not saying, I understand, the job you have, but I'm just talking about just in general. I guess, the thing to do, maybe in my Pollyanna world, is that somehow we just come out of this process with a better win-win and get to yes for everybody.
I would love to.
Okay.
We'll just have to find the way.
You got it.
And with regards to the GTS site, we take a lot of time, as we've discussed, designing, reviewing these stormwater management plans, and a lot of that comes down to the land cover, being concrete pads versus open space versus wetlands versus whatever it is. And so they came in with a plan that had, let's say, 11.5 acres of impervious area on it. Then they went out and built another half an acre of impervious area. It doesn't make a huge swing on all those numbers. What's that going to be? 5 or 6% swing on the numbers. But if you're building your design with a 1 to 2% margin of error in it, we need to check and make sure that your calculations still work. So that's all we asked them to do, was go back and update their calculations based on what they actually built.
Okay, yeah, but I tell you what, I think it's really tough, especially in hard economic times. And I don't want to be accused of defending developers, but once again, they build things, they employ people, they purchase things, they keep the economy going to a large degree. But once again, I'm just saying, if we could somehow, and I really believe this is possible, we have to get to yes somehow, and hopefully in a more practical way, because for our city to go forward, we're going to have to create new revenue sources to bring in new non-displacement type businesses and housing for people and everything like that. So obviously, the better we can improve the system, and I really appreciate your attitude toward this. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, anyone else? Mrs. Henley?
Maybe sometimes the property just can't get to yes. And I guess your question was, should this be expanded beyond the southern watersheds? I know it all started in the southern watersheds. But I think what we learned in the southern watersheds was that there are a lot of different elements in the southern watersheds than what had been in the northern part of the city. And so what had been being done in the southern watershed, we found out just didn't work. And I think that was the thing that really caused all of this stuff to explode in 2014 and so forth. And then, of course, along came Matthew and Julia, and we looked around not only in the southern watersheds, but in the northern part of the city, and we said, wait a minute, these places are flooding. Why were they allowed to develop the way they did? And so if we make a mistake at this time, it's going to come at some point. If there's a mistake, it's going to be revealed when we've got one of these extreme weather situations. So you've really got a can't-win situation almost for these folks. If they try to make it so that it's going to work in all of these extreme situations, it's going to be more difficult. And so somewhere or other, we've got to come to that middle understanding of, you know, what are we going to say we're going to accept, because we're demanding that we don't have another Windsor Woods and Princess Anne Plaza flooding situation or an Asheville Park situation. We're demanding that those don't happen again, but now we're saying to these folks, wait a minute, you've got to hurry up and approve it a little bit better when they're trying to how to not make those mistakes. I don't know. I think we've got to look at this from their angle and from the other, and we've really got to look at it in a broad situation, and we can see, and I think they have clearly said, these are some issues and some things we're having difficulty with. But we know that now that we've done all this modeling, we know stuff now. You know, that's what did you know and when did you know it? Now that we know that we've got these difficult situations, if we don't make the improvements, then it's really going to be on us when it does find out that it doesn't work. So somehow or other, we've got to figure it out. I don't know. I'm sure glad I'm not trying to figure out those calculations, because I would never make it. But I think they've brought some issues before us today that we really do need to look at another time, because we've already exceeded our time on this. It's very complicated. And I think we've given them a tough job, and they're kind of telling us, well, we're having some difficulties here, and now we're going to have to kind of work it out in some way. But I think we can't allow things to be approved if we know they're going to flood. Now, how do we do that?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Moss.
Since the gentleman in front of us is an engineer, I assume, and want to just return back to, so I think Mrs. Henley's on target. That's why I'm trying to get back about these models that we are using and getting the right answer. And I'm sure you could appreciate my conversation about macro to micro and verification and risk sharing. So I think, Mr. Manager, when this comes back, I think we have to understand this is an integral part, I believe, of our bond referendum messaging. Because Mrs. Henley always talked, we had a policy component, we had non-material solutions, which is what policy is, and what that's going to buy us with redevelopment and development of what vacant land we have left, but that our trunk system, if I could use that term loosely, that we're going to put in place, the backbone, is going to support our properties as if they were redeveloped, and we redeveloped to the higher standard that we've now set for our community. And that's why I think when we get these micro applications, I really think the model gets us to a point, but then I think it doesn't help us as much at these small site applications. But I think it's going to ultimately come back as we do our maintenance, and I know Mr. Woods talked about this, about our canals and ditches, that our ability to exercise and achieve compliance, and then our ability to actually do the maintenance at the right schedule on our own infrastructure that we own, which is pretty tremendous. We shouldn't be asking industry to do something that we aren't doing. That's how we have appreciation for the cost and the risk trade-off. That's how we get to the solution for because this is a multi-generation commitment we're making that many of us will pass before all this is achieved. Not a thoughtful thought, but that is true. But nonetheless, we are building a Virginia Beach for the future, not just for today. So I really think we have to be mindful of the compliance piece and knowing where the model starts and the engineer still at the desk starts. You know, don't trust the spreadsheet. You know, it will give you the number, but it isn't always ground truth. So just say that the models have their place, but good old common sense still has a place to play in our work. And I think you would concur with that. And I would just ask that we have a common sense approach, but Mrs. Henley's right. We want to get compliance, but I do believe maybe we need to have simultaneous reviews, which is what I've done in my past work, where everybody's at the table at the same time, and you walk away you know, not iteratively, but sit down for maybe 3 days and be done, versus passing it back and forth. There is something to be said for that, and then know what the risk that goes with that. And then go back and apply this to past things that didn't go well, and said, if we followed what we're now proposing, how would that past bad decision, would this have caught those errors? Would that have made a difference? I think that's a good way sometimes to think about a proposed change, is how would that proposed change, looking back, aided us in making a better decision than what we know was a mistake. And I think that's a pretty, common practice, in industry to do, and I think we could benefit from that, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Wooten and then Mr. Tower.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My comments are more so to one of the comments that were made earlier about increasing review cycles. I would be interested in knowing what elements increase those review cycles, because in my conversations with developers, they do indicate to me that they will do or work on certain suggestions or requirements, and then once they work on those, then they have to come back, and then they get another set, and then they work on those, and then they come back and get another set. And so that suggests to me that there are some inconsistencies. And I've heard this on more than one occasion, and it's becoming a recurring, pattern that I'm hearing. And so I would be interested in knowing what are the elements that increase those review cycles, and what goes into those review cycles. Certainly, if you can provide that information maybe at a later date, or that would be really helpful to me. I've also heard information from some developers when they say that it took them maybe 8 months to get a permit for a parking lot. And those are some things that I kind of, make note of, and would like to find out, how does that happen? Because what I'm hearing, I've heard from several developers, I'm hearing the side today, the feedback that I'm getting from staff, and I guess I just want to know, how do we meet in the middle, to kind of make this the process more feasible for all. And I'm certainly committed to continued conversation and working on this item on both sides to ensure that we do have that, understanding, and find out what causes some of those delays in projects like a parking lot for 8 months. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Tower?
Thank you. I, like Ms. Wooten, I've heard some of these same comments. First, I want to compliment staff. I think your summary of what the issues are reflect in pretty good ways what I have heard from the development folks who give me calls as well. I do think there's one question that I've heard more than once, and I have my colleagues here that have been dealing with this for a lot longer than I have, and this is, I really struggled to find a way to understand the whole process enough to make a decision about policy issues. But certainly this business about that is either, well, it's either attitude or it's regulatory. And my belief, having been involved in a lot of different regulatory processes, is that it's almost always both, a mixture. And I understand that, but that's not something that we can pass an ordinance that says, well, you're going to have a better attitude. So I'm going to assume your attitude is absolutely what the city manager and what we would expect to represent Virginia Beach. So the questions I ask, the only question that I really want to put on the table is, I have heard developers say, and I'm just curious as to what your take on it, is that Virginia Beach is requiring more than the Commonwealth of Virginia would require, and that if we were to require what other cities in the area require, which is a Commonwealth of Virginia standard and not presumably a higher City of Virginia Beach standard, life would be better for them at least. Could you comment on that observation?
Sure. Well, to start, we are absolutely more stringent than the state minimum standards. There's an entire section of the Public Works Design Standards Manual
Right.
that is labeled sections more stringent than the state minimum. So we have set that out on purpose to be a more diligent protector, to be a more resilient city moving forward, and trying to ensure that we don't worsen any existing flood problems. Which is another point I'd like to make, is that we're in the planning department. We're reviewing site plans that come through. We're doing our best to make flooding the same. We're not trying to fix flooding problems here. Public Works has a lot of smart people working in a lot of groups to try and fix flooding throughout the city. We're just trying to make sure that whatever gets built doesn't make it worse. And I'm not very versed in the specifics of Chesapeake or Norfolk or Portsmouth, how they differ from the state. But we were reviewing against the state standards and had a lot of issues. Some of the issues that we saw were from the standards that the state builds are mainly written by people who work in Lynchburg and DC, Arlington, Alexandria areas. They are hilly terrains, they're dealing with a lot of slope and dealing more with erosion and how water leaves. We are low, we are flat, and we deal with weird things like wind tides. Nobody in the state is writing things for Virginia Beach. So we're trying to get additional things written to account for things like the wind tides, to account for things like building a new subdivision where the ground is at elevation 6. What are we going to do to make sure that works?
And now that you've had some experience doing that, is it your opinion that the standards are what they should be? You're not asking us or suggesting to us that we either increase or decrease those standards?
I think it is absolutely worthy of discussion. We're a year into these, and we still have a majority of projects that are coming through are still grandfathered under the Public Works specifications and standards. Like I mentioned on one of the slides, there were 3 things that we expected to have a big impact. There were a few things that have had more impact than we expected. I don't think that these standards should stay unchanged for the next 30 years. I don't think they should go away. I think that we should talk about it, figure out what's working best, figure out what can be tweaked, and make it work best for the city resiliency and the city's continued economic development.
How are you expecting, you mentioned generally about talking to developers. I mean, do you have plans in place for meeting with the development community?
Councilmember Tower, yes, we do. We typically meet with the developers as part of conversations with the council members, but also as part of permit stat. We had our first meeting in December, but then because of the COVID mass vaccination efforts, we had to redeploy the team to focus their efforts there. We do plan to re-engage the building developer community and hear their feedback based on some process improvement that keep the intent of the program and adjust from there and keep council aware of any changes we're making. And should there be a need for any policy change, bring that forward to council and discuss with council.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm glad you're doing it, and I appreciate your report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, did you have something on anything, the appeal board?
I'll turn it over to Bobby here.
Thank you.
Mayor, members, and council, I'm sorry we are over our time, but I will try to run through this as judiciously as possible. The Stormwater Appeals Board was enacted when the state became a Virginia Stormwater Management Authority, having our own Virginia Stormwater Management Program. Part of that requirement was to have a Stormwater Appeals Board. And of course, in 2014, as Seth had noted, when the state changes came up, we did create the Stormwater Appeals Board. The Stormwater Appeals Board has a very narrow focus. As it's currently listed, it hears the appeals of decisions of the VSMP administrator. There are 3 VSMP administrators, one for each of our authorities. One is for private development, which is the Development Services Center, which is CARI. The other is for public projects, which are CIPs, which is in Public Works, and also for public utilities. And it also reviews the application of the requirements of stormwater management ordinance and whenever there's noncompliance and violation notices. And any of the decisions made by any of those administrators could be appealed at any stage of construction. So someone could get a violation notice, as you can see here, for a ENS violation, and the person could say, I disagree that it's a violation, I want to appeal, and they have their right to appeal. Key thing that I wanted to note is that each member of the board should have some type of knowledge of each phase of construction, not just the development or design stage. The current board makeup, there is no term defined for them. There are 6 voting members as currently laid out. There are 3 members that represent each of the VSMP administrators, 1 from Planning, Public Works, and Utilities, and 3 currently citizens that are appointed to the board. One's our retired city engineer, another is a local licensed land surveyor, and another one's a citizen that has an environmental engineering background. This group has not yet met. They have not had a meeting, nor have they had anyone appeal any of the decisions to this board, because right now their purview is very small as far as what they could review and take up. Staff is proposing some changes to the Stormwater Management Appeal Board in order to allow for this comprehensive look at dealing with stormwater. As we've noted, Carrie and Seth have brought up preliminary stormwater analysis and the design process and review, and we wanted to have an outlet where this board could have an opportunity, as designated by council, to review any type of appeals of our decisions when it comes to the interpretation of the code that applies to stormwater management. Part of that, we do want to review the board's makeup, establishing a 3-year term with a max of 2 terms, and of course, removing staff as voting members. It made sense at the time of why it included 3 staff members, because it had 3 of the ones that would be impacted and having represented on the council. But now it would be proposed to be having a 5 members that are appointed by city council, and each of which that have some background in the development process or design process, as you can see here. One of the key things we want to do is to expand the board's authority to take on appeals of the Public Works Design Standards Manual as it's interpreted by for developments, the Development Services Center, or potentially the Public Works. Currently, right now, as it's drafted in the Public Works Design Standards Manual as it was adopted last year, the variances are granted by the Public Works Director through that manual, or his designee, which currently right now is Phil Pullen, and then it has an appeal process, so it goes from the designee to the Public Works Director, but it doesn't have a body that reviews it independently from the city staff. The proposal that we have is to change the variance section of the Public Works Design Standard Manual that will allow us to expand the Stormwater Appeals Board to be able to accept or review appeals of Chapter 8 of the Public Works Design Standards Manual, which is the chapter that deals specifically with stormwater only. As you know, the Public Works Design Standards Manual covers everything in design to meet the city standards, which include street width and other things like that. This, of course, would limit the scope of the authority of that board to just Chapter 8, which just deals with stormwater. And this change would require council approval since this was an adopted manual. So the process for appeals, as we envision it through the process, would be, and this is how it is also currently laid out, a decision is made by one of the administrators, the applicant or the person that receives the decision, which would preferably be in writing, similar to zoning appeals, could file within 30 days an appeal, and then a hearing would have to be scheduled in 60 days, and then a public hearing would be held by the board, and they would have their decision rendered. Please note, just like similar to other boards, the Stormwater Appeals Board can have their decision appealed to the circuit court. One of the additional things that we wanted to add was potential findings as they hear any types of appeals. It's important to make sure that we keep that framework involved. These findings are similar to the ones that are required of staff if they were to grant an appeal or a variance to the standards. Some of the notable findings that we have is, of course, approving the minimum relief necessary and also making sure that it's reasonable. And one of the key ones is also that it does not directly conflict with the requirements of the state law. As we had discussed this, and Mr. Moss had brought up the discussion that he'd had with myself and Mr. Williams, we had discussed the Stormwater Appeals Board. One of those inclusions was a suggestion of an academic professional to be on the board so that there's someone independent that could take a look at the facts and is not in the design process or a contractor of some sort. Coastal Virginia Builders Association, which is what was formerly known as TBA, they suggested to be very specific to include a local civil engineering practitioner. And then they also did give us concerns over the 30-day deadline to submit an appeal. And also, one of the questions that we have is 5 members sufficient in order to hear the appeals that deal with stormwater for the city. So just to wrap up very quickly, the proposed amendments that we have, one would be the makeup of the board as well as the changes to allowing the Stormwater Appeals Board to hear appeals to Chapter 8 of the Public Works Design Standard Manual. If there is no issue with that, we would plan on bringing it either at the last meeting in June or one of the meetings in July in order for us to stand up the additional members of the board. And again, one of the key changes is to remove the staff as a voting member from the board, but we will continue to be the staff members providing support to the board, which includes having the planning department as being the key kind of intake group to help facilitate the meetings, which is the last bullet there, to formalize that process for us. And with that, I just open it up for any questions? Discussion.
Yeah.
As a liaison to this group, I think the recommendations are the right move. Only thing if Mr. Stiles at some point in time before we hear it, whenever we have words substantially, I know we always have problems with that. So if there is a way, and I do believe we need to narrow down the criteria for the board to act on and what that, but if we could find a better operational term or at least define what substantially means, that's so ambiguous, it's often it doesn't leave the board with, well, what did we mean by substantially detriment to the neighbor? I think we need to avoid vagary if possible, and I would appeal to Mr. Stiles to see what we could use in there that would really provide more narrowed definition and an operational definition for the board. But other than that, I applaud your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Bobby. Great initiative. Thank you. Okay, now if we can move expeditiously through the next couple things so we can get to a review to get into things. Any council discussions at all? Ms. Henley?
Yes. I believe it was at the May 18th meeting when we dealt with the issue of the Urban Agriculture Standing Committee. I voted on the prevailing side, and I think we have a policy that someone voting on the prevailing side within 30 days can ask to reconsider the vote. This is a planning item. It may only apply to planning items, but planning is a very important part of this. And so I am going to ask that I be able to reconsider my vote and maybe others as well. At the time, I asked if we were creating this standing committee or if this was just a study committee, and I think there was a sort of a nebulous answer that I hope it's going to be a standing committee, and I guess that's the way it looks it's going to be. But I really think there's a lot of homework that has to be done first, that needs to come first, because we've got 2 very long-standing commissions that are going to be heavily impacted by this new committee, and I think the courtesy is for us to consult those. Those are the Agricultural Advisory Commission and the Planning Commission. The Agricultural Advisory Commission up until now has pretty much been the body that dealt with agriculture. Agriculture is all over the city. If we're going to now make this a rural versus urban thing, I really think the Agricultural Advisory Commission needs to have some input. I also said that, the agricultural department provides things citywide. It's not just in the rural area through extension and VPI. I know Councilman Bellucci was concerned about people who want to do gardening. Well, there's a very robust master gardener program in existence now, and they would be happy to have additional people. The extension does a lot of things for the urban folks, and I think we're going to be having a lot of conflicts if we don't look at all of this before we go starting out and coming up with a whole new duplicating situation. So I really think the Agricultural Advisory Commission needs to have some input into what's going to be happening. I think they also have a lot of insight into what it is to be raising domestic livestock. And then there's the Planning Commission. Now, we can do everything that I heard mentioned that wanted to be done. I think we are either already doing it or can do it. The only thing that we can't do is to have these domestic livestock with chickens and pigs. And in order to do that, there are going to have to be changes in the zoning ordinances. And that's going to be up to the Planning Commission to do. They're going to have to do an awful lot of looking at the issue to determine what they're going to recommend. And I think it's only common courtesy that we ask for their input. We're going to be having the short-term rental public hearing later this afternoon. And this issue is going to have to go through all of the gyrations that's gone through in developing the ordinances and what the requirements are going to be. As a matter of fact, the Farm Bureau very quickly had put together just some of the other localities in Virginia that allowed chickens and what's involved. I think this is from Midlothian. Number one, keeping of chickens has to be incidental to a dwelling on the premises. 2, it's limited to the keeping of a maximum of 6 chickens and does not include roosters. C, at all times, chickens are kept within a single building having a single attached fenced outside run as follows. Building is a minimum 10 square feet and a maximum of 20 square feet. Fenced outside run area is a maximum of 40 square feet, has a minimum area of 5 square feet per chicken, and fenced outside run is securely enclosed on the top and sides with a wire mesh or similar material. D, building and attached outside run area located in the rear yard and set back 25 feet from all property lines. E, slaughtering of chickens does not occur. F, areas associated with keeping of chickens is cleaned and made free of waste on a regular basis. Waste is disposed of in an appropriate waste disposal container that is periodically removed from the site. Certainly, we've got to be concerned about water quality. And G, property owner employs an effective means of eliminating odor problems and propagation of insects related to use. That kind of thing is what's going to have to be developed, and it's going to be up to the Planning Commission to do that. And I really think that they need to have some out of courtesy, some input. I'll just mention like Newport News. A chicken coop can be no closer than 175 feet from a neighboring structure where people live or work and 300 feet from any school. So all of these things are going to have to be looked at, and that's the Planning Commission's bailiwick. So I am suggesting that we not move forward with this until we at least allow these two long-time standing commissions to have some input. I think it's only common courtesy, and I hope we will delay any action until we have done looking at it and gotten some input from these folks.
Ms. Henley, we can discuss when the consent agenda if you wanted to, make a motion.
If I'm going to, okay, I didn't know if you wanted to do it through asking to reconsider or if we want to just delay action or how you want to do it, but I just wanted to mention these things. I will say that there was a pretty strong pushback from the agricultural community, and I really think they need to have some input.
Mr. Stiles, what would your advice and counsel be?
Ms. Henley has the right to make a motion to reconsider any member can make a motion to reconsider any item within 30 days of its initial passage, provided they were on the prevailing side. You've not utilized that very frequently, but that is within Robert's rules, and the ordinance says that where there's not a specific provision, Robert's rules controls. So it would be a motion. It would require a second and a majority vote, and that would reopen the item, and it would have to be then voted on again.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Would it, Mr. Stiles, would it need to be voted on the same night?
The motion to reconsider has to take place within 30 days. When you hold the new reconsideration vote, I don't believe so, but I'd like another minute to review that.
Okay.
So then Mrs. Henley could bring it up under new business and make that motion.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, why don't we do that, Ms. Henley? Okay, Ms. Wilson.
And I had a question too. I was not here for that vote, so I was not on either side. So how does that affect me, Mr. Stiles?
You would not be able to move for reconsideration, but you could vote on whether or not to reconsider. The entire body gets to vote.
Okay. And I'm, Ms. Henley, I'm really glad that you brought this up. I was really stunned that it was going to be a whole new commission. I thought it was, when it came up, it was going to be more of a task force to look at it, to make recommendations, rather than establishing a whole commission. And I agree that this is going to be a planning commission item, and we've got the agriculture commission who could weigh in on it. And if it was more of a task force or a study group, I wouldn't have as much of an issue with it. But being an entire commission, I'm not even sure we're really ready for all that, because we don't know where the recommendations would be and how it would need to go forward as a solid commission to go in longevity. Is it really needed, once suggestions and recommendations are made? So thank you for bringing this up.
And we'll certainly allow it to be brought up during old business, okay? Any other, yes?
At the appropriate time, and maybe it has to be approaching soon, since the deadline for a bond referendum question is in August, the earlier part of August, I would like to make sure that either it's a special workshop or what we need to have, but we really haven't spent a lot of invested time on our messaging, how that's all, I know that the city manager is working on that, but I would like to think that we wouldn't be going, or maybe we're not going to July recess, because I think we have stuff on our plate, but I'll leave that to the larger body to decide. But I'd like to think that we would have gotten something materially to look at before we go into our traditional July recess, because when we come back, then it's August. Next thing you know, it's the ballot question and the votes due. We usually hold a public hearing, so I hope we're backing up a timeline, Mr. Mayor, that we can make sure that we're ready to execute and have done our homework, so that we know how we're messaging this and all that stuff. And the clock, and right now, time is no longer our friend.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Ms. Wilson?
I'm sorry, I just want to ask, if we're going to bring this up under old business, what about, we have the ordinance for the appointments prior to that. So shouldn't we be talking about this before we vote on the appointments? The ordinance for the appointments?
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Number 4 under ordinances?
I would suggest we defer that issue until we decide otherwise.
Okay.
Well, Ms. Abbott's not here, so I think she deserves, as a sponsor of it, to
Yeah.
have something to say when the time comes.
I think that'll be appropriate. Okay, and anybody at this point has any liaison reports or comments? Yes, ma'am. Mic on.
The Green Ribbon Committee had a pretty extensive report regarding the proposed CBPA regulation changes, and it really kind of is apropos that it's at the same night that we heard this. I'm just going to tell you that this is an issue out there, but the HRPDC presented some comments, and I'm assuming maybe our city did. I think P.J. Scully is on the regional workshop group, and there's a lot of concern about these new regulations and the fact that they are maybe not really haven't had the attention that they need. And so it's something that I'm just going to say we need to watch, because we're ultimately going to be asked to enforce these. So just to let you know that the Green Ribbon Committee is looking at it, and something I think we want to be on top of as we go forward.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Under ordinances and resolutions, so we're talking about on item 4, an indefinite deferral on that. Is that what everybody? Can you?
I said, pending any objections from Mrs. Abbott, who sponsored it, and she's.
I object to an indefinite deferral on item number 4.
Okay, so we want to hear that one then? So we'll pull that one. Okay. Everything else, item 3, I've heard some concern from some of the members, and this is the resolution to extend the deadline for the recommendation to June 30th, because they don't feel they have enough time to do that. The recommendation that I heard was August 30th. Would you accept that? Okay. All right, then we'll need to hear that one too then.
I haven't heard those same concerns, and I'm happy to entertain them, but I'd like to hear them if that
Okay.
is really the concern. Then that will help me, better structure a resolution or so for that. But I don't think August is the time frame.
I think the concern was that they would not be able, the staff wouldn't be getting anything out until this week with a report back date of 3 weeks from now, which isn't much time.
I could certainly maybe look at changing it to sometime in July, but not August. And is the staff saying that that's what?
No,
Oh.
the staff, I've heard from people who've been appointed to this, who
Oh,
have asked
not.
about the June 30th deadline because some people aren't going to be in town, things like that, so there's no time between now and
they're not going to
then
be in town.
to do it. So then, and then you basically, they'll have time for maybe one meeting, which I don't think is what the intent was, but, it's fine. I mean, we can handle this during the, we can just hear it and discuss it then.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. So then, items 3 and 4 we would hear. Are there any other items on the ordinances, resolutions? Mr. Moss?
Mr. Vice Mayor, I will be abstaining, and I have a letter on file with the city clerk on item 1 due to my investments in Dominion Energy, and 2, because it deals with the Navy, and I have gone back at the Navy's request to work with them part-time, so I feel that's an appearance of conflict, so I'm abstaining, and I also have a letter on file on items 1 and item 2.
Got it. Anybody else on any items? Okay, under planning items, items 2, 3, and 5, we will be hearing because of speakers or requests from the council member. Item 1, Anatoly and Joy Ann Dricilio for a street closure, 7.5 foot by 50-foot portion, unimproved alley adjacent to the rear of 737 Vanderbilt Avenue in Beach District. Consent. Item 4, Mark Moore, conditional use permit, Ray short-term rental at 2229 Maple Street. That's the Lynn Haven District. I'm fine with that. Does anybody?
I'm a no.
Okay, so it's a, okay. Item 6, Half Moon EXT LLC, James Goldstein for conditional use permit, Ray short-term rental at 305 16th Street, Unit A. Item 6. Okay. No? Ms. Henley, are you a no on that one? Is anybody else voting nay on that one?
I am.
What was the,
Number 6.
Number 7. Number 6, I'm sorry, number 6. Number 6.
what was the decision on number 5?
Number 5 is being heard.
Thank you.
So number 6, we have Mr. Moss voting nay.
I'm voting nay.
Ms. Henley voting nay. Okay. Item 7, Victoria Mason, Dominic Mason, conditional use permit, Ray short-term rental at 304 28th Street, Beach District. Mr. Tower. Okay, does anybody wish to vote nay on that? So, item 8, Colin Tomlinson, Jason Walker, conditional use permit, short-term rental, 304 28th Street, different unit, Beach District, same? Is that the same for you, Mr. Tower? And that would be the same nays?
No.
Okay. Okay. Item 9, 10, do we have any speakers on item 9? Because we had a lot of emails on that. Okay.
There's a lot of neighborhood opposition to that. I would be very surprised if there's no opposition to speak.
When I left the office about 12:15, we did not have anybody signed up yet.
Well, I'm going to be recommending denial,
So you want to hear that one then?
Well, if, I'm going to recommend denial, if you want to
Okay.
hear it. But there's a lot of neighborhood opposition, and that is no place for, Planning Commission recommended denial. That's no place for a short-term rental.
I don't know that we can do consent for denial, can we?
Consent for denial, yeah, think so?
Well, if the applicant's not here to speak, you can, but if the applicant's here to speak, you typically let them speak.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that's what you do.
So then we have for items being heard, ordinances 3 and 4, and planning items 2, 3, 5, and 9.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Chair will entertain a motion to recess into a closed session pursuant to the exemptions of the open meeting allowed by Section 2.2, 3711A Code of Virginia as amended for the following reasons. Publicly held property, discussions or consideration of acquisition of real property for public purpose or the disposition of publicly held property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiation strategy of the public body pursuant to Section 2.237A3, Princess Anne District, Beach District, Beach District. Legal matter, consultations with legal counsel and briefings by staff members or consultants pertaining to actual or probable litigation where such consultation or briefing in an open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the public body pursuant to Section 2.23711A7, Holloway et al. Versus City of Virginia Beach and Booth versus City of Virginia Beach. Personnel matters, discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining, or resignation of specific public officers, appointees, or employees of any public body pursuant to Section 2.237A1. Okay, and, okay, then this would be council appointments, council boards, commissions, committees, authorities, agencies, task force, and appointees, and also performance of council appointees. Do I have a motion? Okay, motion and a second. If we can have the vote, please, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Abbott, absent. Councilmember Bellucci?
Aye.
Councilmember Henley?
Aye.
Councilmember Jones?
Aye.
Councilmember Moss?
Aye.
Councilmember Rouse? Councilmember Tower?
Aye.
Councilmember Wilson?
Aye.
Councilmember Wooten?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Wood?
Aye.
Mayor Dyer?
Aye.
10-0.
Okay, we are recessed into executive. Let's take a short break.